Hi, welcome to our Know Thy Addendum series. This is where we're going to go through a series of addenda that we have that are pre-prepared, where you just kind of fill in the blanks. There's also a blank one where you can hand write whatever you want, but there's a whole myriad of addenda that you could use. So, and again, our theme is we don't rise to the level of our expectations, but we fall to the level of our training. So that's kind of a theme here at Aubrey and Associates Realty. We're an education company disguised as a real estate brokerage. So let's get going. So first, what is an addendum? Okay, so the dictionary says an addendum is a noun, an item of additional material, typically omissions added at the end of a book or other publication. Okay, Wikipedia says an addendum or appendix in general is an addition required to be made to a document by its author subsequent to its printing or publication. So the plural is addenda, which is that which is to be added. So essentially, it's in addition. It's additional material. It is not a state-approved form. It is not a document that's found in the MLS. If you were to draft terms on a napkin and both the buyer and the seller signed it, then that would be an addendum. Okay, it's not a pre-printed form, which most people, or not most people, but there's kind of a folklore that that's what that means. So I'm here to dispel that myth. It is anything that is added to. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. So let's look at a standard. This is a standard blank, what I call blank line item addendum, where you just fill it in. The purpose I'm showing us here is I want to go through the different parts of the addendum. The top of the page is the identifier, right? It'll name it so if it's a pre-printed one, it'll actually have the name, but it'll also say addendum number. So you can number every addendum. So, and then that way there, it's easier to see the hierarchy as things go by if they're all numbered, right? Because if you had FHA, VA loan addendum with no number into it, well, was that before, after, that kind of stuff. So I realize you can look at the dates and all that, but this way here, that's a real simple way of establishing a hierarchy by putting in a number. Then if you look here and notice here, it says this is an addendum counteroffer, right? So which is it? So an addendum is added to the offer, or it could be added to an executed contract, right? But a counteroffer is different. So if you're preparing an offer and there's a term or a clause that is not in the purchase contract, then you would use this and add it to your offer, addendum it to your offer, right? So where the counteroffer is, if you presented an offer to a seller and the seller said, yeah, but we want to make a slight modification. Let's say it's the sales price. So you make an offer. They love everything about your offer. However, they're not excited about your price. They're going to counter offer, and then they would they would just put in sales price to be, and then that would be it. So that would be a counter offer because you haven't had the buyer didn't add it to the contract. The seller's modifying the terms that were presented to them. So that's a counter. Now, when I said, what if you're under contract? So let's say you're under contract and you need to modify a deadline for whatever reason, it doesn't matter. You would use this as an addendum because it's not a counteroffer at this point. And it's not an addendum to the offer, it's an addendum to the contract. So you would just say settlement deadline to be X. Now let's suppose the seller says, that doesn't work for us, so we're going to counter back. So the seller would then create a counteroffer and say settlement deadline to be X. So that's so that it kind of help you understand the difference between a counter and an addendum. Now they're both an addendum, but it's just how they're displayed in the chain of events. And again, this is the identifier. It's going to be with the offer reference date, because we always use the offer reference date because that's the first established date, because we don't have a contract date yet when you're making an offer. So we use the offer reference date to give us something to tie it together and to go by. Okay, and then it identifies between the parties, right? Blank is the buyer and blank is the seller regarding the property located at. And then the following terms are hereby incorporated as part of the Rep C. Okay, so that's your identifier. Then your clause. This is where if it's pre-printed, it would have all the information. Some of them are a page and a half long, and some of them are real simple, couple lines. This is what they call the blank line item, or it's blank, or I call it the line item because you have lines and you can write items in there. So that's the clause section. The next section is the clarity and time of acceptance. And what do I mean by clarity, right? So because if you're not clear, you always want to be clear, right? Always move towards clarity. So what it said, let's read what it says. To the extent the terms of this addendum modify or conflict with any provisions of the REPSI, including all prior addenda and counteroffers, these terms shall control. So if you had a REPSI that had a settlement deadline of X, and then an addendum that had a settlement deadline of Y, and then the seller countered back and said, no, we want the settlement deadline to be Z. So then the last one in the chain of events would be the controlling term, right? So as it says, that if it, to the extent that the terms of this addendum modify or conflict, then these control. So it's the last one. That's why it's also important to number them, okay? And then not modified by this addendum shall remain the same. And then you're saying seller or buyer shall have too. This is the time of acceptance. And because this document can go both directions, you have to establish who has what time to accept it, right? So then it says seller or buyer has until blank blank, what time, 10:15 a.m. or p.m. on mountain time on blank date to accept the terms in accordance with the provisions of 23 of the REPSI, unless so accepted, the offer as set forth in this addendum shall lapse. So what does that mean? So that means, let's say it's the buyer presenting this document to the seller, and then the buyer checks the seller shall have until 5 p.m. On blank date. Let's say that equals tomorrow, or even today, if you like. Let's just say it means today, to accept the terms of this addendum in accordance with the provisions of Section 23. Section 23 of the REPSI explains how acceptance occurs. You can go back and watch that video. So unless so accepted, the offer is set forth in this addendum shall lapse. Okay, because so that begs the question: can a seller or can a party accept this addendum after the acceptance deadline? The answer is no, because the offer doesn't exist anymore. It shall lapse. Poof, it disappears. Okay, so that's why it's important. So let's move down to the excuse me, to the next clause or the next section of the REPSI: acceptance, counter, or rejection. So this is where the other party would accept it, and they would check acceptance, and they would identify who they are. And if they accept it, then then they would sign it, date it, and time. They would write the time on there. Most people are using electronic signature solutions, so it would have a time stamp. But so you can have a timestamp that's past the time of acceptance deadline because the offer doesn't exist. So you can't accept past the deadline. However, you can write a counter offer. So let's say you agree to the terms. However, the time of acceptance has passed. So then what you would do is you would actually have to draft another counter offer and say, whatever you are. So, hereby accepts all terms of the, addendum blank, identify the addendum, and then create a new time of acceptance for the other party to accept that. But you cannot accept something that the time of acceptance has lapsed because the offer doesn't exist. But you can counter or you can reject past that deadline. Okay, makes sense? So these are standard sections of each REPSI. So we'll move on and we'll start. But that's the end of this section. So anyway, so we'll get going.